Good morning. As I said, it is our Different Lens series this morning when we listen to voices that might be different than the ones that we have traditionally heard in the church. We know that each person reads the Bible and the world through multiple lenses that we may not be aware of related to who they are and how they're raised and what kinds of things have happened to them in life and what they've learned along the way. And we've also been handed a way of reading the Bible and different ways of interpreting the Bible from theologians down through the years, and often without us even being aware that what we're hearing is an interpretation. And most of those voices have been white men, and their perspective is valid. It just needs to be known as a perspective, which allows space for others to have different perspectives and for new voices to be heard, both on how we're interpreting life events and how we're interpreting the Bible. When others have approached the text or talked about life and done good work studying it, we sometimes hear and find new insights and understandings that are more helpful to our time and place or to particular groups of people, which can be liberating for everyone. Kelly is going to introduce us to a model for understanding oppression today that has given him insight into how things operate in our culture and how that can give us some perspective to some biblical stories as well. So Kelly, where do you want to begin with that today?
Well, I'd like to begin a little bit with that introduction, and I'd like to credential myself a little bit. In addition to the wonderful job that you've done, Holly. Shall I run with it a little bit now? Or
yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I just want to begin because I often like to credential myself that I'm a Lutheran pastor. I'm a graduate of a Lutheran high school, a Lutheran college, and a Lutheran seminary. And I think a major calling and opportunity for us is the reality about breaking our chains as people of God. And that chain really is manifested in racism. And I think about racism much like maybe Martin Luther thought about indulgences back in the 1500s, back when people got their identity, their sense of being closer to God, more revered, more valuable, based on the ability to pay for their sins, a system called indulgences. And it was in confronting that system of indulgences that led to the Reformation, and which led to the Lutheran Church, the Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, and all of those churches that were a liberation from an identity that was based on works or ability to pay our way to be closer to God. Well, today, I believe that manifestation is in race, in the system of racism, which pays a way for people who adhere to that system of race that goes into that sense of what whiteness is, that the more that one adheres to that system is a way that one feels closer to God. And by closer to God, I mean economic advantage, educational advantage, housing, all of those ways that people are comforted based on the empire or the system that allows people to feel like they're more valuable, more precious than others. The other thing I want to just lift up is how close I felt in your introduction that you talked about belonging. And you invited people into the experience of church as an invitation to belonging. And I think that that's a major translation of the gospel, and that it transcends the boundaries of race and class and culture, that everybody belongs to the reality of God. And how meaningful it is that you began your worship with that statement of belonging, because that's how God came into our world. God didn't phone it in and say your salvation is here now. God sent Jesus into the world, came into the world with that bold statement of belonging. And that belonging was exemplified by Jesus being in relationship with the marginalized, with people who were told that they didn't belong as framed by the empire, but by the reality of God. Everybody is safe and everybody belongs. And I just want to lift that up because I heard that so clearly as you gathered and welcomed each other into worship, that everybody belongs. And that's a core value and statement that begins with God and is our calling into our world. As Holly mentioned, so there is something that I learned from the Oakland Men's Project many years ago, even before Holly and I met 25 years ago. And the cycle of oppression is a framework that really, and I want you to notice when I share this framework, nobody read a book, you didn't study, but what this framework is based on the natural knowing and experience that we have within us now. So that framework begins with, it's called the cycle of oppression, and it begins with people being labeled or stereotyped, targeted. And then based on that labeling or stereotyping, then we attach misinformation to that person or that group. Then based on that misinformation becomes the justification for mistreating that person or that group. And then that final part of that cycle is what's called internalized behavior. And when I explain internalized behavior, I will often use the example of if I have a dog, and every time my dog does something wrong, I will kick my dog, even though it has done nothing wrong. And my dog will learn to act that way, even though it did nothing wrong. It will act as if though it did something wrong. That's internalized behavior. Now, to make that a little bit more real for you, I want to invite you to, let's look at that cycle and the example of George Floyd. Right? So George Floyd, in the example of policing, is labeled, stereotyped as a Black male. The misinformation about a George Floyd would be that he's a criminal or that he did something wrong, that he it may be whatever he did was said to have done with a $20 bill. But then based on that misinformation, which some might call information, but the misinformation then is the justified mistreatment to put my knee around him for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Even as people in the crowd surrounding are saying, get your knee off his neck, or he's dying, whatever that is. But for those policemen, for those policemen, that was a justified mistreatment based on the cycle. And then for George Floyd, people like George Floyd, is that if that's how I'm being treated, then I begin to act that way. So like maybe that was a very drastic one to begin with. But let's look at that and step back and maybe look at the cycle as an example, just for natural knowing and walking through that. Let's say a targeted, a labeled, stigmatized person might be female. And think about when you go in the grocery store and you might look at the magazine racks. And what do those females look like?
Not me.
Well, the misinformation is thin, glamour, all of those things that might go with that. Then the justified mistreatment, if the female doesn't look like that, then a person is less valued, ostracized, joked about. And then the internalized behavior might be anorexia and bulimia. So that's one example. And so females, again, in that cycle of stereotype and stigmatizing, the justified mistreatment, the misinformation might be not as smart as men, not to be paid as much as a man. Then the justified mistreatment, of course, don't encourage to go into math and sciences. Don't pay them as much as males. And then the internalized behavior Have you ever heard the term dummy down?
Mm-hmm.
And not to know as much as you know?
Mm-hmm.
Those are examples of a cycle of oppression. Now this is really a challenge to talk about the cycle when we're not visibly present to each other, where we can have this interaction where we're really in dialogue about this. But think about the cycle of oppression for girls, and they're maybe not seen as as smart as boys, or if a boy or a man is assertive or aggressive, what do we say about that man? We say that he is assertive. He's a winner. He's a leader. But if a woman or girl is assertive or aggressive, well, we won't go there.
Right.
Right? And so the justified mistreatment, again, is don't call on them as much as the boys. Don't encourage them to do sports as much as boys. Don't encourage them to be the spokesperson or the leader on the team at work. And then the internalized behavior, again, is to dummy down, pretend not to be the leader, not to submit themselves to the kind of pressure that goes along with distinguishing themselves to really living up to their gifts.
Don't speak and don't offer the wisdom that you might have, because it's not going to be heard anyway, and it's probably not as good as other people in the room. But
yes,
yeah.
Thank you, Holly. I'm glad you are here. You can help me. We can be interactive, right?
I'll try.
Yes. So another one is GBLTQ, right? As a targeted group, a stigmatized group.
Mm-hmm.
The example might be that effeminate, or the one that I grew up with was that they're out to get me.
Mm.
And then based on that, the justified mistreatment is
you're going to stay away from those people and probably beat them up.
Ostracize them, beat them up, kill them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the internalized behavior is closet themselves.
Yeah.
Be effeminate, stereotype of
Mm-hmm.
what it means to be GBLTQ. And so that cycle perpetuates itself.
Mm-hmm.
And Holly, when you and I met, that cycle was very much about youth. That youth as a targeted, stigmatized group, was the misinformation is they don't really care.
Mm.
They don't really know enough. And particularly in the church, not take them seriously. Right? And then justified mistreatment was only allow them to be acolytes, right? Not put them in positions of where their voices were taken seriously. And the result of that internalized behavior, what do youth do when they complete confirmation? They drop out.
Yeah.
They don't show interest in the church. But do they set that? We set that up with the cycle of oppression, and we get the results that we are set up to get. But we blame the other person who's actually the victim, and we wind up with these cycles of blaming the victims. So why this is so important is to be able to step back and see our role, our complicity, and putting people into those cycles, perpetuating the cycles, and abandoning people and blaming them when it's actually our systems that are in place to ostracize and lock people into lives where they don't exhibit or experience belonging. They experience alienation and hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Why I find this cycle so helpful, it is a wonderful opportunity to see the real Jesus, and not just this Jesus that we have made into this docile, really nice guy in the Bible. What Jesus was in the Bible, if we really look at those biblical stories, Jesus is the Son of God coming into the world, and he aligns himself with people that are in cycles of oppression. So I really invite you to look at those stories, like the woman at the well, and how Jesus comes And there's a woman who is locked into a cycle of oppression. So the story goes really something like this. It's a woman who goes, she's had a bunch of marriages or relationships that have not gone well. And so she gets labeled and stigmatized. So when she goes to the well in the morning when it's cool when all the other people gather, what she hears are all these terrible stories about how awful her life is. And so it's systematic. She goes through the cycle. She goes to the well, and she hears these oppressing, depressing stories about how awful her life is. And so that cycle is perpetuated. But what this woman does, she goes to that well at the hottest part of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And she goes at the hottest part of the day because the last thing she wants to hear is the misinformation and the mistreatment about how awful her life is. And so she suffers through that perpetuating cycle that further separates herself. And then what does Jesus, the Son of God, do? He comes and he has a relationship with this woman, affirming that she really does belong to the salvation of God, a relationship with God. And it's God aligning God's self with this woman and breaking the cycle of oppression. So really encourage you to look at those stories of children and women and all, people who are sick, all of those ways that there are cycles of oppression, and God aligns God's self with those people.
In that story you brought up, it's in at least three different ways too, right? Because she was a Samaritan. So she questions why he's talking to her because of that, and because she's female, and because nobody else talks to her, even among her own people.
Yes. And why aren't we doing Bible studies that really get into the real substance of what's going on in those stories,
mm-hmm.
and how powerful it is that God crosses those boundaries
mm-hmm.
to be in relationship. It's a real story about the power of God, literally power of God, aligning itself, God's self, with people who are stigmatized and powerless. Why is that important in relationship to race? Because we have a society, a culture, and a system that perpetuates Black and brown and marginalized people into cycles of oppression. And do we confront those cycles, or are we complicit with those cycles?
Mm-hmm.
That's a real challenge for us as people of God, and how important it is that white people embrace this story and this reality without going into places of blame and guilt and shame,
Mm-hmm.
and to actually look at these stories as how God is present, and not use guilt and shame and blame as an excuse for to not do the work, to not more fully be who God calls us to be as a people of God. So I really encourage you to do a Bible study. Don't do Kelly Chatman's study. Do your own study of those scriptures, and watch how God is unveiled in those stories. And as God is unveiled in those stories, so will be an authentic understanding and relationship with those people that we don't get to see or know, because we've been kind of anesthetized. We've kind of shaped by our culture in a system of white supremacy, white racism. So when you hear those words, please don't go to a place of guilt and blame and shame, but be open to studying and open it. What's behind that? What is that? What's the message behind that? That it might be meaningful to hear, because that barrier is not really a barrier about the people who are marginalized or Black or brown people. It's really a barrier to white people to be more authentically who you are in relationship with God, okay? Without the filter of a system that brings comfort and complicity.
Yeah, and recognizing and remembering that everybody is in that relationship with God, and we come to it on equal footing. And each of us then have a role to play in breaking the cycle of oppression from the various places we enter into it. Yes.
Yes, and that cycle of oppression is affecting us. We are in. When I say us, I'm I'm identifying with white people. Don't yeah. So uh, everybody is subject to the cycle of oppression,
Mm-hmm.
and not just those who are physically victimized, but when we, and this goes back to the indulgence thing, right? But
Mm-hmm.
we're allowed to feel like we are in a better position,
Mm-hmm.
closer to God than other people. That's the very thing that the indulgences did back during the time of Martin Luther. Um, and so we need to be liberated to have a more authentic relationship with God that is purely about God as a source of our salvation and not the systems that are put in place um, that might say that the empire or racism, whatever language or label you put on it, it's the same system.
Mm-hmm.
And we all need to be liberated from it and have an authentic relationship with God.
That was a nice way to tie it back to the beginning with the indulgences too. So I want to thank you for offering that new lens for us to look at things through, knowing especially that it's been helpful for you over the years. And I want to go ahead.
Can I introduce one other thing?
Yeah.
We have time. So right now, I'm blessed to be leading something called the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement. And right now we are writing a book. It will be a workbook, and it follows 3 stages. The first stage, and it's kind of stage of development. The first stage is called forming. And the forming is a question of that invites you to think about the first time that you noticed race or difference.
Mm-hmm.
So just to remember the first time that you were aware and conscious that there was race or difference. And then the next stage of that development, it's called reforming, of what decisions did you make based on difference and or race. So just reflect back on that, and it's just think about what difference did that make to you. How did you see people of a different race or a different sexual orientation or a different culture? And then the third is called transforming. So it goes from forming, reforming to transforming.
Mm-hmm.
And the transforming is to remember that time or those times when you embraced difference, when you saw the value in difference, which is a relational stage of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so to reflect back on that and to think about that forming part is difference is just difference, right? And then the decisions that we make about difference and race particularly as largely informed by a society or a culture that benefits from seeing that race negatively. Right? And then, but transforming is our relationship with God and how God calls us to be in relationship with others, in relationship with the world. So to be able to reflect back on that and internalize and look at our process in our lives about how we're oriented to think about race and think about difference, and to think about the liberation that happens when we think about difference as a gift, as opportunity. And a challenge for the church is to think about how we're complicit.
Yeah.
And where do we get stuck, in those 3 stages? And again, I want to affirm and celebrate that as you began your worship and talking about belonging, that's that transforming state, right? Of saying the gift and the blessing about being the people of God, the community of God, God's beloved, which ties us back to our Reverend Martin Luther King. He talked about beloved community. What he was lifting up was this vision about where where we are all in the kingdom of God, that we are all beloved, and just what a great opportunity. And thank you again, Holly, to lift that up today of all days, the day when we celebrate the life and ministry of Reverend Martin Luther King.
Yeah, it makes it great to have these two things at the same time. What I like about what you just gave us about the forming, reforming, and transforming is that's a tool then to put in conversation with the cycle of oppression, because going through the engagement of awareness of how you were forming and reforming and transforming is a way to break the cycle up at the misinformation place, because it's bringing awareness to where the misinformation was that you're handed down from the culture.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good. A little unrelated, I have some fun questions to end with today. So, and maybe they're fun and maybe they're not, depends. You have a book or fiction or nonfiction that has captured your attention lately, or that you wish would capture white people's attention?
Oh, well, one of the books that's very meaningful to me that I'm rereading is People of the Lie by Scott Peck.
Wow. Okay.
I think it translates very well into everything we've been talking about this morning.
Okay.
And how we racism is a lie. The isms are a lie, and what happens when we buy into that is that it takes us away from our calling and our faith and who God calls us to be. And so I just love that, how meaningful it is that Scott Peck is able to articulate that as a lie.
Mm-hmm.
What it means to be living in a reality, and the lie equates with evil. I'm just rereading that, and I find it very helpful.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for reminding me of that one. Can you tell us what song always makes you dance?
Oh, I'm not much of a dancer.
I don't know if I believe that.
My wife's a dancer, and I love the Break Every Chain. But I don't listen to enough music.
All right. How about podcasts? Do you ever listen to podcasts?
Not really.
Okay.
I would love to. I'm afraid to say that I've been too busy.
Yeah, I get it. Even after your retirement, it happens.
Yeah.
If heaven exists and God has a voice, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive? Which we hope isn't for a lot of years.
Well done, good and faithful servant.
Yeah, good. And my last question is, we are going to close with a poem or quote from you, because I'm going to use the benediction from the Church and News Service. But if you had another poem or quote that you'd like to share with us, feel free.
Yeah. Well, there's a aphorism that I really love. It says, okay, but a bird does not sing because it is happy; it sings because it has a song. And that may have come from Maya Angelou.
Yeah. In that caged bird sings. Yes, does.
Because I believe we all have a song, and it isn't just about being happy.
Yeah.
It's having meaning and purpose in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's enough.
Yeah. Good. I'm going to close us there and say a quick prayer. So we'll bring you on again at the very end to say goodbye, but I want to thank you for the wisdom that you shared with us today. And if you get a chance to go back and look on Facebook, you'll see that there are some people. Well, Peter was here, of course, watching. And there are some people. Heidi found a lot of meaning in what your words were, and Roxy and others too. So I'll share some of those with you after the service too.
Well, thank you, Holly. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. We have your friend Berlin Brown coming in a couple months as well.
Oh, awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll probably call him today. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. Tell him how it went.
Yeah.
All right.